Yeah, let me just get my notes up.
All right,
Um,
welcome everyone. So today I'm talking with V, who's someone who just sort of reached out to me to have a chat about the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And this is just going to be a fairly informal chat. I guess a bit of context here. So I'm going to be debating Maverick Christian in a week, I think it is now, about this argument or what he's written about this argument. And so I'm started to prep for that, although I haven't read all of his article yet on that. But so V here just wanted to share some thoughts and chat a bit about the argument. So yeah, that's what we're doing, and I thought other people might be interested to listen on. So put put it up on the stream. Yeah. So just for clarification, this V that I'm talking to is not the same V that Digital Gnosis uh, sometimes does on his channel and brings him food and such. I did foresee that confusion, but such as it is, we've got multiple Vs around. So V, is there anything you wanted to sort of say it in virtue of introduction?
no, I don't have anything particular. Um, like V is for Venus, so in case you have some other V, in
Yeah.
case there's some other V out there. But we can get started on the argument if you like.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned V that you had a you reached out to Maverick about this argument, and maybe you want to tell us a little bit about how that went.
Yeah, I mean we were chatting. I mean it's been like 20 days. I reached you like 20 days ago, and I sort of haven't touched the argument since then. But mainly I think there's like an issue with the. Well, I think you could probably raise an objection to the first and the second premise. So maybe I can lay out the argument first for
Sure.
context, and then yeah. So like there's like mainly two premises: what is known as the probability premise and what is known as the defeater premise or the defeater thesis. The probability thesis and the defeater thesis. So the probability thesis is just that given naturalism and evolution, the probability that your cognitive faculties are reliable. So cognitive faculties is going to include everything from like your senses to your reasoning, memory, everything that's involved in belief uh, construction, basically, is going to be low. And the feeder thesis is going to be that anyone who believes that naturalism in conjunction with evolution and also believes that R is low given N and E, naturalism and evolution, has a defeater for R. Um, and so maybe I just want to give a definition for defeater. So in this case, a defeater is going to be a belief such that as long as I hold that belief, I cannot. So if let's say if D is a defeater for B, then as long as I hold the belief that D, I cannot rationally continue to hold B. And so the idea is supposed to be that as long as I believe naturalism and evolution, and I also believe the first premise of the argument that the probability of R is low given N and D, I cannot rationally continue to hold the belief that my cognitive faculties are low. And so those are sort of the two main premises of the argument. And then the third premise is just going to be anyone who has a defeater for R has a defeater for any other belief she thinks she has, including naturalism and evolution. The third premise is going to be if anyone accepts N and E, thereby acquires a defeater for N and E, N and E is self-defeating and cannot rationally be accepted. So that's just to say that N and E are self-defeating. And the conclusion is that N and E cannot be rationally accepted. And different people have attacked this argument differently. So some have targeted the first premise, but I more have an interest in the second premise, the defeater thesis. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So just to remind people of which is which. So the first premise is the premise about the reliability of cognitive faculties under naturalism, right?
Yeah, so the first premise
Yeah.
is the probability thesis or the
Yes.
probability premise. That's just that R is low given N and E.
Hmm.
And the second premise, the defeater thesis, is that if you believe N and E and you believe that the probability of R is low given those two beliefs, that you have a defeater for your cognitive faculties being reliable.
Okay. So you wanted to focus on the second one.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Um, well,
Go ahead.
Maybe you want to say something like, I assume you think both of the premises are problematic from like your point of view.
Yeah, so I think that the idea about reliability of cognitive faculties is really a problematic notion. Um, yeah, Camille, I'm seeing if we can get a written format. I'm just sort of looking up a good formulation here. But the second point about defeaters, I find
Sent
I
one in
find a
the
little
chat, by the way.
confusing. Sorry.
I sent the formalization of the argument in the private chat in the StreamYard. I think.
Oh, okay. I'll see if I can. Yeah, I was going to actually share something from Maverick's page, but anyway, while I look that up, so the idea of the defeater, explain that to me. How's that supposed to work? Because I've heard this explained slightly different ways. What's the nature of the defeater supposed to be? Is it the idea that if you don't think your cognitive faculties are reliable, you can't believe anything else? I feel like I'm missing a step there.
Well, I mean, there's all this other like external. I mean, are you familiar with like externalist epistemology?
Yeah, sure, but for our
Yeah,
listeners,
I
why
was
don't you
just.
explain what that is?
Well, I sort of just wanna. So like Plantinga, if you actually read Plantinga himself, he talks about Humean defeaters and other types of defeaters, but I sort of think that just like overcomplicates the argument. At least what I'm trying to focus on. So defeater is just supposed to be the idea that if one belief defeats another belief, it's the case that if you hold the defeating belief, then you cannot hold the defeated belief um, and maintain rationality. So you're going to be irrational if you hold both beliefs. So, for example, let's say that let's just give you an example. Let's say that you come into my factory and you see that all the objects are sort of like red, all the widgets are red, um, and then I tell you there's like this light that's just shining on all the objects that makes them appear red. Um, so that sort of like defeats. Uh, that sort of gives you a defeater for your belief that the objects are red, and so you can't maintain that belief unless you can no longer maintain that belief and be rational. So that's going to be the idea. And there's supposed to be a distinction between rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters.
Yes, I
Yeah.
remember that. Let's leave that to the side for the moment. So I've put up a version from Maverick's blog here, which I think is good for clarifying some of the points that we're talking about here, or at least summarizing them is probably a better way to say that. So yeah, let's think a bit about this this defeater thesis here. So the way it's stated here is premise 3, anyone who has a defeater for R, which is one's cognitive faculties are reliable, has a defeater for pretty much any other belief she has, including naturalism and evolution. So this has been discussed. Oh, I can't remember where I talked about this. I think it might have been in a stream I did with Nathan when we looked at this argument. I've forgotten quite where it was, but the idea of the reliability of cognitive faculties, because that just seems to be really underspecified for me, and kind of the whole argument seems to depend on what this means, because it's not just premise 1 that's relevant to that; it's also premise 3, the feeder thesis, right? Because we need to be able to assess, it seems to me, whether having a defeater for R means we have a defeater for other things. That is, how important is it that our cognitive faculties are reliable in whatever way that's construed?
Okay, I see what you're asking.
What does it matter if our cognitive faculties are reliable, to put it another way? What falls out of that?
So Sosa, who's sort of famous for epistemology, has analyzed this argument as holding to something like an implicit premise view. And so the idea is that for all your belief productions, your cognitive faculties being reliable has sort of been an implicit premise. So sort of like you can think of all of your beliefs. See, this is kind of funny because I don't think it's not as if all your beliefs are sort of formed as some kind of an inference, where there are premises and a conclusion. But the idea is supposed to be something like you have your premises, any of your conclusions, the conclusions being your belief. And there's this implicit premise that your reasoning is functioning correctly there. And so once that premise goes away, all the support for your beliefs goes away. And once you lack that support, you lack rationality for your beliefs. So that's one way of thinking about it. And I think Plantinga rejects that's the right way to think about it. But Plantinga isn't really entirely clear why it is the case that if R is unreliable, we sort of have a defeater for all our beliefs.
Yeah, because I like what you said there. The fact that a lot of our beliefs are not sort of consciously inferred in any way. So I don't know that they're even deduced from a set of premises. But even aside from that, it doesn't seem to me that anything follows from the fact that our cognitive faculties. Let's suppose they're generally unreliable, just for the sake of argument. It doesn't seem that any particular thing follows from that. I mean, it's perfectly consistent to say that our cognitive faculties are unreliable, but also we can be justified in knowing certain particular things. Because unreliable doesn't mean like always false, right? I
That's
mean,
correct.
that
Yeah.
wouldn't even make sense, right? Because then you could just take the opposite of whatever your cognitive faculties said. So that kind of. So, like, just trying to think about what that means. This is like the least reliability you could imagine. I guess it would just be saying that whatever processes we use to arrive at beliefs are generally tell us nothing about their likelihood of being true. It's kind of just noise. But that could generally be true, and it still be the case that in specific instances we had justification.
That's
So
right.
it seems to me maybe you'd have to strengthen the claim and say that our cognitive faculties are like never trustworthy in some sense, or never provide justification for any conclusion, or something along those lines. What do you think?
Well, just a couple of, for example, if we look at, let's say like a 5-year-old or something, or like a 6-year-old, we can grant, unless it's some kind of a genius 6-year-old or something, right? We can grant that they probably don't know how to do propositional logic, first order logic, and other things, and so they wouldn't be able to deduce something like 2 + 2 = 4 from the Peano axioms, the axioms of number theory. But we would still say that they know that 2 + 2 = 4. And so in some sense, we would say that the cognitive faculties are unreliable for doing mathematics in the justifying sense of like deducing the theorems of number theory, which includes 2 + 2 = 4 as a theorem. But nevertheless, we'd still say they're justified in their belief, even given that R is unreliable. But if I could just quickly, I think the way, at least this is for a second premise, but it seems to be the case for the third premise. I have to like revisit Plantinga, but the way they proceed in the second premise is sort of by analogy, because sort of like Plantinga admits that he doesn't have some kind of a principled criterion for when something is a defeater and something is not something is not a defeater. And so it's sort of like providing all of these analogies and then asking what's the symmetry breaker between N and D and the XX drug or Cartesian demon or other cases. And I think that's what they're trying to do with the third premise. They're like, well, we would say that all your beliefs are unreliable in the case of Cartesian demon or in the case of the brain in a vat or evil scientist or whatnot. So why is it not the case here that if N and E is true, that all of your other beliefs are sort of like you're irrational to like hold those beliefs? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. So Plantinga, I think, uses the drug, or a series of drug analogies about if you were given a drug, or
that's right.
That
The XX
how does he
drug.
phrase it exactly? Yeah, renders one cognitive faculties unreliable for the vast majority of those who take it. General cognitive unreliability, such that those afflicted can't even rely on their cognitive faculties to determine whether they've passed reliability tests. Blah blah blah. I still don't quite see why general cognitive unreliability implies anything about inferences in particular cases. that just doesn't really make sense to me, because reliability is about like truth aptness or degree of justification or something like that across a range of relevant cases. And you can score poorly on that in general, but still well in particular instances. So I mean, I understand what you're saying is they're going to give a series of analogies and ask us, well, would they be justified in believing such and such in different cases? But I'm a bit skeptical about how well formed those thought experiments are, just because they don't really say anything much about what it is that's defective about the cognitive faculties of the person in question. They just say that they're generally unreliable. I don't even know what
That's
that
right.
means.
Well, that's sort of where I want the discussion to go, but
Sure.
I sort of wanted to go for the second premise. So I think just for the sake, we can come back to the third premise, but for the
Yeah,
sake
no
of
worries.
the argument, let's grant the third, the fourth, and the first premise. And let's just focus on the second premise, right? So the idea, again, there, like Plantinga will say that there isn't some kind of a principled criterion for when to determine whether something is a defeater or not, because he admits that it's not the case that for any p and any q, that those just stand for propositions, um, that if given q, p is low, that q is a defeater for p. Like, he doesn't hold to such a principle. Plantinga just rejects that. So for example, that your body produces sweat to cool down your body is going to be low given naturalism and evolution. But you wouldn't say that now, since you believe in naturalism or evolution, your belief that your body produces sweat to cool down to cool down is now, you're irrational in believing that. Or another example, right? Let's say that you have the winning, that you won the lottery, right? And you're holding the lottery ticket in your hand. Your belief that you won the lottery, given that there's a million, or let's say a billion lottery tickets, is going to be low. But we wouldn't say that you're now irrational in thinking that you won the lottery, because you also believe that there was a billion lottery
Mm.
tickets. So Plantinga rejects such a principle. So the question becomes, well, why think it is in the case of N and E that generates a defeater for R? And this is where Plantinga says, I mean, I can get the quote, but uh, where he says he takes a particularist approach. And so he will just produce a set of thought experiments and then ask, well, what's the symmetry breaker between this thought experiment and the and NND? And this is where I think that the argument fails, because I don't think at least in the case of Maverick, he provides sort of like 6 or 5 thought experiments. We can go through them. And then he says, well, if the first one goes through, the second one goes through. And if the second one goes through, the third one goes through. And if the third one goes through, the fourth one goes through. And if the
Mm.
fifth one goes, and so on. And if the fifth one goes through, then N and D goes through. And I think that's just going to be false, because imagine something like the following, that let's say that you believe that you have some kind of a gene. Let's say you believe that you have gene Z, and the doctor calls you and says, the pill I gave you the other day renders your cognitive faculties unreliable unless you have gene Z. In such a case, it doesn't strike me as a defeater is generated for your belief that your cognitive faculties are unreliable. Whereas in the other cases that Maverick or Plantinga provides. And then the question is, why think that N&E is similar to the cases that they provide as opposed to the thought experiment that I just provided? Did that make sense?
Sorry, I didn't quite follow the last thing you said about the particular gene. Could you say that again?
Oh, okay. So let me just pull up the thought experiments here. Okay, here we go. So can we just go through the ones that at least Maverick inspired by Craig gives, and then I'll tell you why I don't think these support the argument.
The series of 6, I think there are.
Yeah, that's right. Is there a way I can share my screen
Sure, yeah.
so that you can
You should
see?
be able to do that if I just Stop sharing.
Okay.
In
Okay,
general,
here
I'm
we
going to
go.
be fairly. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, let me just. Oh yeah, well, yeah. So that's that's the series. We kind of need to know what S1 and the others are, but yeah, that's specified in the paper. But I was just gonna say, in general, I'm pretty skeptical about these sort of thought experiment type arguments. But yeah, we can go through them if you'd like.
Yeah. So I think something like you can
Could he
grant
really
that.
not have done it in fewer steps? Like, why does it have to be this many steps? It's just really tedious.
No, I agree. So what I think is the case is we can grant that from S1 to S6, in all cases a defeater is generated, but then just deny the number 15. And so S1 is just going to be that initially I believe that Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable, but later I learned that Sam took the drug XX, and that after he took the drugs, he came to believe that a doctor has called him, informing him that he has the blocking gene, and that he has passed cognitive reliability tests. I have no independent reasons for thinking Sam belief about the alleged doctor's call is accurate. Since the belief of Sam came days after he took the drug, I conclude that Sam's belief was likely the product of unreliable cognitive faculties. Um, my belief drug XX has entered Sam's bloodstream defeats my belief that Sam has reliable cognitive faculties. So this is supposed to be about another person, not about yourself. So so I tell you that Sam has taken this drug, and that 2 days after he took the drug, he reported that he got a phone call from the doctor saying that you have a blocking gene, a gene that makes it such that you don't get the bad effects of the drug. Um, that piece of information doesn't deflect the defeater. That's supposed to be the idea. And
Yeah,
so merely that you believe that he took the drug gives you a defeater that his cognitive faculties is unreliable. So that's supposed to be the first one. And when we can grant that for the sake of the argument. Then the second one is
sure.
supposed to be um, no, we're no longer talking about another person. Now we're talking about you. So you come to believe that the doctor has called you saying that you have a blocking gene after you've taken the drug, days after, and that you have passed a set of reliable cognitive tests. But since this belief came long after you taking the drug, it seems that the would-be evidence for my cognitive faculties is undermined by the drug XX, just as the would-be evidence for Sam. So the idea is just supposed to be if there's a defeater in this case of Sam, then there's a defeater if you're the person. If we just change you with Sam. So again, if S1 holds, then S2 holds. And now once we grant S2 we have to grant S3 as well, which is supposed to be that you've taken the drug soon after you were born, and sometime later you build a machine that I know is capable of reliably detecting whether and when the drug has entered a person's bloodstream, and there is overwhelming evidence for the machine's reliability, such that a positive result removes all reasonable doubts. You take the test, and it tells you that the drug has entered your bloodstream at the time that you were born, and so you are confident now that there is actually the drug is inside of you. Um, Later, you come to believe that you've taken an extensive battery of cognitive reliable tests to confirm that I have the blocking gene, but since this belief came long after drug XX entered my bloodstream, it seems this would be evidence for my cognitive reliability is undermined by the drug. So even if you build a machine, you find out that the drug is in your system, but then you take a set of tests, and the tests come out as saying that your cognitive faculties are reliable, those would not deflect the defeater, and you'd still have a defeater. So your belief that you took the drug when you were born gives you a defeater for your cognitive faculties. That's supposed to be the third example. And so if you accept S2, you're supposed to accept S3 as well. Now S4 is supposed to be about a mutation, not about the drug. But now there's like a mutation that afflicts a small portion of the population, and there's a small chance that one with the XX mutation also has the blocking gene. I have heard the rumor that I have the mutation, and I have constructed a device similar to the one in S3. The device tells you that you have the mutation,
The machine reports that I have the mutation and thus the drug XX entered my bloodstream soon after I was born. Later, I come to believe that I passed a series of cognitive tests. My belief drug XX entered my bloodstream defeats R for me just as it does in the other cases. So even here, if you come to find out that you have the mutation, even if you take the test, that's not supposed to be help you out. And these are sort of like similar, so we don't have to go through them. But the objection that I'm raising is you can sort of like grant all of these, but I don't think these are analogous to the defeater thesis. Because imagine the following scenario. Let's say that you know from birth that you have a gene called gene Z. You don't know anything about this XX stuff, right? You just know that you have that gene. Um, and then I call you today. I'm the doctor, and I call you and I tell you, look, there is this thing called the XX mutation. There's this thing called the XX drug, and you took it last time you were at my office. But this drug only affects people who don't have gene Z. And remember, you believed that you had gene Z before you took the drug. Before I called you, you were justified in believing you had the gene. Now, if I'm the doctor and I call you and I tell you, you took the drug, but the drug only affects people that don't have gene Z. In that scenario, it doesn't strike me that you have a defeater for your belief that your cognitive faculties are reliable. Now, let's say that we have a person, right, who is not a naturalist and does not believe in evolution, but he sees that for somebody who believes in naturalism and believes in evolution, that given just those two beliefs, their cognitive faculties are going to be unreliable. But there's this third proposition that when taken in conjunction with naturalism and evolution, R is very high. And let's say that this person believes in that third proposition. Now, let's say that this person discovers some evidence for naturalism and evolution and comes to accept naturalism and evolution. Now, this person here, his case strikes me as similar to the scenario that I just gave, and not these scenarios S1 to S6. Did that make sense? And so if that's the case, then the 15th premise is going to be false here. This is supposed to be the argument for the second premise, but this is going to be false in light of what I just said.
So hang on. So you said that someone comes to believe in naturalism and evolution, and that R is low under naturalism and evolution. Reliability is low.
So remember the scenario of the doctor that I gave. I said you believe that you have gene Z, and then the doctor tells you about the XX drug and tells you that that you took the drug, but it only affects people who don't have gene Z. In that scenario, I said a defeater is not generated. Then I gave you another scenario. I said, let's say you don't believe in naturalism and evolution, but as a philosopher, as a thinker, you see that naturalism and evolution, given those, R is going to be low. But you also see that there's a third proposition that when taken in conjunction with N and E, renders R very high as opposed to low. And
yeah, right. So what's the third proposition? I missed that.
Oh, no, I'm not specifying what it is. It's unspecified.
Is that important, though?
No, it's not important for the thought experiment, because the point here is I'm just showing that the thought experiment here is analogous to the thought experiment of the doctor that I gave. It's more analogous to that thought experiment than the S1 and S6 that is provided for the motivation for the second premise. So what I'm saying is, imagine that you don't believe in evolution and naturalism, but you believe in a third proposition. It's unspecified. I don't think you need to specify it here, but we can go ahead into that. And you see that R is low given N and E, but it's high given N and E and the third proposition. Then after that, you discover some independent evidence for naturalism and evolution, and you come to believe in naturalism and evolution, right? In that case, is your scenario closer to the one that I gave of the doctor, or is it closer to one of these provided by Maverick here, or the ones provided by Planting of XX?
Yeah. So if I understand what you're saying, is that we could have some other reasons for thinking that our cognitive faculties are reliable even under naturalism and evolution.
Yeah,
And
that's
then,
right.
given that, we wouldn't find ourselves defeated by these sort of scenarios.
Yeah, so the idea is supposed to be that, so there's this thing called the contingent. Sorry, let me just scroll up. I think I have it here. So there's this problem known as the conditionalization problem, and the idea is supposed to
Yes,
be
right.
what are you allowed to conditionalize over, and the
Yeah.
idea of these thought experiments that Planting and Maverick provide is that they want to exclude things like that you took a set of cognitive tests that said that your cognitive faculties are reliable. Because if we included that proposition in conjunction with N and E, R would be very high. But they want to exclude the move that we can conditionalize over those, because they want to say that those beliefs came in after you took the drug and you believe that you took the drug, and that anything that you come to believe after you took the drug and you believe that you took the drug is excluded from being allowed in the set of conditionalization. But I'm saying that in the thought experiment that I provided, that you believe that you have the gene Z, and you believe it before you even know that there's such a thing as the drug XX. Then the doctor calls you and says, you've taken the drug XX, but that drug only affects people who don't have gene Z. In that case, I'm saying you're allowed to conditionalize over the proposition that you have gene Z. And once you conditionalize over that, you've taken drug XX in conjunction with that, doesn't render R low. Did that make sense?
Yeah. I think so. I'm still struggling on a few points here. One of the things, and as some people are noting this in chat, I find all of these thought experiments very confusing because, apart from the fact that they're just so long, they talk about drugs and blocking genes that just don't seem to have any connection to the idea of evolution and naturalism. So my understanding is that these are supposed to be building up to an analogous situation, or a situation that's alleged to be analogous to, evolution under naturalism. But what I'm having trouble is understanding how the analogy is supposed to work, and I think this connects with what you were just saying there. So, what is the drug that makes our faculties unreliable? What is that supposed to be analogous to in these thought experiments? Is that supposed to be analogous to us coming to believe in evolution and naturalism, or is it supposed to be analogous to just like the fact of the fact of naturalism and evolution? Because I'd understood it in the latter sense, that us having that taking the drug that makes our faculties unreliable is supposed to be analogous to us having descended via entirely naturalistic means, through evolutionary processes, which then leave our cognitive faculties unreliable. And in that sense, it seems that it wouldn't actually matter what you believed about the cognitive faculties. It's just about the fact of them having become unreliable through that process.
Okay, I see what you're asking. So it
It's
was
about what the analogy is attempting to be analogous to,
yeah,
I guess,
yeah,
is the point.
yeah. So earlier we went through S1 to S4, and S5 and S6 are sort of the ones that connect this XX drug thing to evolution and naturalism.
Yeah, well, I find it just so hard to work through these because there's so much going on that I find it hard to keep it all in my head, and I feel like I'd have to spend hours just on each one. But also, I don't know why there has to be so many of them. It just seems very confusing to me. Like, for example, so I disagree with S6, it seems to me, because that's the one that is directly related to naturalism and evolution, right? So then if I disagree with that, all I have to do is go back and say, well, somewhere along the line, I obviously stop agreeing with Plantinga here. Like I must, right? Because it follows from that if I disagree with S6. I don't feel it particularly helpful, just speaking for me personally, to find exactly where that is. Because, I have to go through and painstakingly work out exactly what is entailed by each of the statements that he makes in each of the segments there, and work out, yes, so this is where I think that I would say we now stop having knowledge of, whatever the difference is. And I just don't really feel like I can be bothered doing that. So what I'm interested in is how the analogy, just thinking about it more generally, is supposed to fit. Like, it seems to me that the drug is supposed to be analogous to the processes that brought about, like evolutionarily under naturalism, our cognitive faculties. They're supposed to lead to a state of them being unreliable. And that, it seems to me, is supposed to then kind of cast a shadow on any beliefs that we form. Now, in the analogy, it's every belief that's formed after taking the drug, right? But in reality, so to speak, in because that's just an analogy, it would be any belief at all that we've formed, because all of our beliefs are formed after the evolutionary process. So it seems to me, with respect to the conditionalization issue, that they're going to say, look, this argument needs to apply to all of our beliefs, because you can't sort of condition on a belief that you formed prior to the evolutionary process, because there aren't any such beliefs.
Okay, so
If that's
I
how I'm
agree with-
understanding how the analogy is supposed to be working.
yeah, so the analogies are just supposed to be that if you see my screen, that if you grant
Yeah.
that there's a defeater in S1, then you have to grant that is in S2, and if you grant that is in S2, then S3, and then if you grant, then once we get to 6, if you grant it's in S6, you have to grant that it's the case in naturalism.
Yeah,
and
I
evolution.
understand that's how it's supposed
And
to go,
here-
but I'm rejecting that style of argument. I'm going to say that, look, I'm just going to reject S6, and then say I don't know where, in virtue of that, like if I reject S6, then somewhere along the line I've rejected one of the
Right.
early ones, and I'm going to say I don't know exactly where. What I
Well,
would
that's not-
ask is how the argument is supposed to be analogous, and then work backwards to figure out where I disagree.
Just quickly, like if you reject S6, it doesn't mean that you've rejected something else. It could just be that you reject the 14th premise here. That maybe you might say that, look, there is a defeater in S5.
Yeah, that's
but
what I
there
mean.
isn't a defeater. Yeah.
Somewhere
So you're just
before
saying that
I've
one of
rejected.
these, you're saying that, look, one of these premises is false. I just
Yes,
haven't
that's what
worked
I
out
mean.
which one. I just haven't worked on which one is correct. But I don't need to do that in order to be justified in saying this argument is not sound. That's sort of what you're saying.
Basically, yes. And one of the reasons I'm saying that is because it's just such a belabored argument. I can just look at S6 and say, look, I don't agree with that. And then if someone wants to provide me with an analogy, then what we can do is unpack the analogy and see how it's analogous, right? But what I don't want to have to do is step through laboriously all of these different steps. But basically, because I guess here's how I'd put it. I don't find these sort of thought experiments very persuasive at the best of times. And so my initial intuitive reaction to one of these, like, might well be wrong anyway. So what I'm going to try to do is work out how it's analogous to other cases where I actually think I have a more grounded judgment rather than these very abstract processes. So that's actually why I'm going to ask, look, how is this supposed to be analogous? And then my judgment there is going to help, it's going to inform me about how I'm going to respond to the thought experiment. So I kind of just don't want to play the game of thinking about these thought experiments in the abstract. Because like I just don't even really know, and they're hard to understand, and I don't trust my intuition there anyway. So what I'm going to say is at the end point where I can kind of understand how it connects to anything that I care about or understand, like evolution and naturalism, I'm going to say, look, at that point, yeah, I disagree with S6, right? As to before that, well, I'm not quite sure. I feel like it needs to be more grounded for me to even make a judgment about it. So that's why I'm asking, like, how does the analogy kind of work? Like, what is supposed to be analogous to what? I understand that that's maybe not what Plantinga wants. He actually just wants you to start at S1 and then work all the way through. But I'm saying, look, I actually can't give proper judgments about these thought experiments because they're so abstracted and bizarre. Like, I'm not even sure at what point I would say no. Like, I'm pretty sure it's going to be at some point, right? Because I disagree with S6, but I'm not really sure where.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, so, I mean, I don't disagree. Well, see, the intuition thing is, I want to comment on that a little. Like, I was just running a specific objection, and the objection that I was running was that even if you granted all of them S1 to S6, that wouldn't entail the second premise of the EAA&E. So even if S6 does generate a defeater, that doesn't entail that the defeater thesis is true. So that's the objection that I was running just now.
So yeah, let's have a look at S6 again. Doesn't that explicitly say something about the defeater thesis? S6 specifically.
Well, it says the probability thesis is true, which we've granted for the sake of argument, but I do not initially believe this and instead think I am the product of a sort of evolution that makes my cognitive reliability very likely. So this is like the standard view before you even engage with this argument.
Yeah.
Later, however, I study philosophy and see for myself that the probability of my cognitive faculties being reliable, given that I am a product of naturalistic evolution, is low. Afterwards, I come to believe I have taken an extensive array of tests that establish my cognitive reliability. But since this belief came long after the naturalistic evolution created by my cognitive faculties, and I believe that given N and E, naturalistic evolution has a high probability of giving me unreliable cognitive faculties, it seems that this would be evidence for my cognitive reliability is undermined by the effects of naturalistic evolution, similar to how naturalistic evolution giving me the XX mutation in scenario 5 undermines my would-be evidence for R. So it seems that I have a defeater from. Okay, I see what you mean. So I'm sorry. What I meant to say was S5. Yeah, if you grant S5, then that it doesn't entail that S6 is correct. That's what.
So yeah, but this is what I was trying to link. So it seems like he wants to make an analogy between the process of naturalistic evolution and some sort of mutation that makes our cognitive faculties unreliable.
That's
Although,
correct.
yeah, so this talks about a drug and a mutation to that drug. Maybe it's a little more involved than that. But see, this at this point, my intuition is already having trouble with this because I just don't think about cognitive faculties as the sort of thing that can be rendered reliable, unreliable by like single genetic mutations or anything of that sort. Now, I know Planning is going to say, look, it's just a thought experiment, right? But that's why my intuition isn't working because I'm like, well, but cognition isn't so simple as that. It's like I don't even understand how that could possibly make sense. So what is my intuitive reaction to it? I just don't even know. Like, it just seems a bizarre thought experiment. How could there be a single thing that makes sure that, well, I guess maybe implicitly that sort of preserves my phenomenology, but also makes my cognitive faculties unreliable? But that just seems really strange to me. I can't even really conceive of what that would look like. So I really struggle with that.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, so S5.
Like, how can I even understand language and have reliable sorry, how could my cognitive faculties be systematically unreliable in the kind of way that I think Flanagan wants to say, and yet I retain the ability to speak to people and to then perform calculations which cohere with my perceptions of what other people say about them? I mean, it could be a brain in a vat, but it all seems a bit odd. Like, that's how could I mean I'll grant that in principle maybe that could happen, but when I'm relying on my intuition to say, like, well, does that idea really make sense? I'm like, well, no, it just seems ridiculous to me.
Right, but what you're doing now is you're targeting the first premise of the argument.
Well, maybe, right? But the thing is that they're tied together, right? Because if you look at S6 here, it says that I think what I'm really targeting, to take a sidestep, is the idea of cognitive reliability, which is what I targeted before. But coming back to this, if we look at S6 here, it says he's saying here that, okay, suppose I come to believe now that under evolution and naturalism, it's unlikely that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Then he's saying, look, any evidence that I get to the contrary, he talks about batteries of tests, comes after the naturalistic process. And so he says that it seems that this would be that any evidence that I could possibly get about the reliability of my cognitive faculties would be undermined by the very process, just like having some sort of mutation would undermine the evidence for our cognitive faculties being unreliable. So what I'm saying here is I can't even really conceive of how we could have a mutation that could undermine undermine our evidence for reliability, let's say, in the sort of way that Plantinga wants. So I don't think I'm just objecting to the first premise there. I'm actually saying I don't even understand the sort of premise of the thought experiment, or it just seems ill-conceived to me. The idea that there's some sort of mutation that preserves phenomenology, but then somehow defeats my belief in the reliability of my faculties in some sense.
Okay, I see what you. So, I mean, there's like this paper in Naturalism Defeated ? By Evan Fales, which sort of makes the point that it's not the case that our cognitive faculties would only have to be unreliable, but they would have to systematically deceive us in such a way that we have a unified phenomenology. Everything is connected, but nevertheless, everything is not how it appears to be. And for evolution to produce such a continuously, our cognitive faculties would basically have to be a Cartesian demon. It would have to like actively be deceiving us. And for evolution to have produced something like that is far less likely than that our cognitive faculty, that evolution just produced us with correct cognitive faculties. So I guess that's sort of like the type of objection you're raising now, right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just really strongly, I'm still thinking about this, right? But I'm pretty strongly reacting strongly against something like S5, because S6 is, as it builds cumulatively, S6 is kind of saying, well, look, if you agree with S5, you should agree with S6 because it refers directly back to it. But then I'm trying to think about, like, what would it mean for a gene or a drug or really whatever to just sort of render our cognitive faculties unreliably? And that just doesn't, for the sort of reason you were saying, it just doesn't even make sense while preserving phenomenology. I mean, I can imagine just being totally crazy, but that just doesn't seem to fit with a lot of other things. And maybe this comes back to the conditionalization problem, that there's a whole bunch of beliefs that I have and memories and perceptions. To try to fit that with what this drug would seemingly have to do to me just seems like it just doesn't make sense. I don't even understand it. And so therefore, because S5 doesn't really make sense to me, I also don't, S6 doesn't have any purchase on me either.
Wait, so why didn't S5 doesn't make sense to you?
Well, let's look into it there. Via a nifty combination of scientific and philosophical argumentation, it's proven beyond all doubt that naturalistic evolution entails that some mutation is part of any humanoid's genetics. All right, so far so good. So we've all got some mutation, right? So then there's some argumentation that says that given naturalism and evolution, it is likely that this mutation rendered everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable. Though there's some small chance of a blocking gene that makes people immune to XX. So I don't quite know what the blocking gene is supposed to be analogous to, but let's just take that part there where it says it is likely that the mutation rendered everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable. Now, I don't know if I'm supposed to interpret that as unreliable, but preserving a phenomenology. Because if not, then it seems like we're just talking about a different reality where my perceptions are entirely different. But if it does preserve phenomenology, that is everything like sort of seems to be as it is, but our cognitive faculties are just unreliable. I just don't understand. That just seems a non-starter to me. Like that just seems impossible, pretty much. Like how could there be a mutation that renders everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable, like systematically, while preserving phenomenology, and yet I can still talk to you? Like because a big part of cognitive faculties is about like understanding of communication and and meaning of words, right? But I'm still talking to you. Like, so is that? It just seems completely absurd that even makes any sense.
Now, when you say absurd, there, I'm just trying to figure out. Are you saying that there's some kind of a conceptual issue with the thought experiment?
Yeah, I think I am, right. I guess implicitly, I'm because I'm implicitly here. I think I'm conditioning on the fact that on our phenomenology. And by that, I just mean things like we can talk to each other, let's say, or we appear to be talking to each other and understanding what we're saying.
Okay, but are you saying? I'm just trying to figure out. Are you saying that there's some kind of the thought experiment entails some kind of a contradiction, such as it's not even logically possible for this scenario to take place?
No, I'm not saying it's not logically impossible. Okay. Let me read this again. There's some argument to say it's likely that there's a mutation that rendered everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable. And I'm going to interpret that as unreliable, but like preserving a phenomenology. I don't know that I want to say that that's sort of metaphysically impossible, although I might lean towards that. But I'm certainly going to say I just don't even know what that means. Like, what does that look like? I don't really understand how that makes sense. How can you have systematically unreliable, in the way that I think Plantinga means, cognitive faculties, whilst we can talk to each other and a bunch of other things? I don't get it. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying I don't get it, and therefore the thought experiment doesn't feel persuasive at all to me because I just don't even understand what it's trying to. I don't understand the premise that it's advocating for. It doesn't seem to fit with how I think about rationality or thought or language or anything.
Okay, so if, for example, let's say that I was planting or Maverick or something, and I was saying, what exactly are you saying is problematic with S5? Is it something like you're saying that you don't understand it? Is it going to be like a psychological block, or is it going to be that you think there's some kind of a conceptual issue or like a metaphysical issue?
No, I think there's a conceptual issue. I think there's a conceptual issue between saying that there's some idea of a mutation that renders everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable, whilst we can still, talk and according to this engage in science. That just doesn't make, like, how does that make sense? And I think I'm really pushing back to what does it mean for our cognitive faculties to be unreliable? I just think that is fundamentally underdetermined. So I don't think there's enough information for me to understand what's even being postulated. Like, you can say the words renders everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable, but I'm still asking, well, what can that possibly mean? Like, what are you saying? What exactly has the gene done? What has the scientific finding in the thought experiment actually demonstrated? I think it's underspecified.
Okay, I see so it's kind of interesting because so I think under like a correspondence theory of truth view, if we're assuming that, it's just supposed to be sort of the beliefs that are produced by your mechanism. Those propositions don't correspond to how the world really is. So that's what's unreliable. That's one way to cash out unreliable. And I assume that's what Plantinga or someone like Maverick wants to say. They just wants to say that the propositions that are produced, the beliefs that are produced by your cognitive faculties, given that your cognitive faculties as sort of like a mechanism of evolution and this mutation and other things, those beliefs that are going to be produced are not going to correspond to how the world really is. Whereas if you held some kind of a pragmatist theory of truth or something, where sort of like truth is just what truth is sort of like a theory with all like correct predictions, something like that. It will be some kind of a conceptual issue here because as long as you sort of can predict, as long as you can predict your environment correctly. That's all it means to have correct views. And if your cognitive faculties are producing those, then they're going to be reliable. So it's sort of like once you take some kind of a correspondence view or something, that this argument is going to make sense. I don't think this argument can be run on some kind of a pragmatist view.
Sure, but let's take a correspondence view and just run with that for the moment. So to say that, I mean, yeah, and I think it is in large part about the idea of rendered everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable. Like, what does it mean for cognitive faculties to be unreliable? So you're saying that the idea is that when cognitive faculties are unreliable, and this is where I'm a bit stuck, our beliefs are, well, can't be our beliefs are always false, right? Because that's sort of question begging.
Mostly false. I think Plantinga takes something like reliable cognitive faculties is going to be something like 75% of your beliefs are true.
Our beliefs about what, though?
Just
our actual beliefs or hypothetical beliefs that we could, because I don't have beliefs about lots of things, right? Like a lot of mathematical, like I just don't have any beliefs. I haven't thought about them. Maybe if I did think about them, like for example, if I just started counting off prime numbers, like, well, is this number prime? Is this number prime? I could form a lot of beliefs about that I don't explicitly have. This might not sound relevant, but I'm going somewhere with this.
I think it's talking about whatever you have in your noetic structure. So if you think about beliefs as some kind of a network of intentional states in your mind, if we took the set of all of those beliefs, Plantinga would say that your cognitive faculties are reliable if 75% of those are true. That's how Plantinga thinks of it.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of our knowledge is non-propositional in nature, which is maybe part of the issue here. But let's put that to the side. I don't think that's critical here. So,
I think it is because.
Well, maybe you're right. Maybe it is
because
a lot of my knowledge, for example, is about like understanding language, for instance. And so I'm asking, like, well, how could I be wrong about understanding language? I mean, I guess I could, right? But like systematically, like that just doesn't seem to really make any sense. Maybe it's even self-contradictory because it says here that I'm capable of understanding scientific evidence about genetics, but somehow my beliefs could be systematically wrong. And like, wouldn't that include my language faculties? Like that's a cognitive faculty, right? Language. I could be systematically wrong about like the meaning of an intention and scope of most, like 75% or more of the words that I use. It doesn't seem I could even come to understand the scientific evidence if that was the case. So it seems to be, there's an internal tension even with that aspect of it. But maybe he doesn't mean that.
So let's just break that. So let's just assume that knowledge is an intentional state, a true-tap propositional state. And then let's just cash that out as being reliable means 75% of your beliefs are reliable. Now, are you saying that that view there, that assumption there, is problematic, or are you willing to grant that and you're still saying that the thought experiment is problematic?
Okay, so you're saying that, hang on, I think we need to take a couple of steps back here. So a cognitive faculty is some sort of process, right? A cognitive faculty isn't just a set of beliefs.
No. The cognitive faculties produce beliefs.
Okay. So then what we're saying when our cognitive faculties are unreliable is that there are these cognitive processes which produce beliefs. I think they do other things as well, but let's say that they produce beliefs, propositions, and that most of those propositions are false.
Right.
Without any qualification about like scope or domain or anything like that. I gather. I mean, Plantinga doesn't make that, so.
Yeah, that can be unspecified for it.
Okay.
Because now we're just trying to make sense of the thought experiment.
Sure. Right. Okay. Well, so let me restate the issue that I had there. Among my large set of beliefs are beliefs about the meaning of words. Now, can my belief about the meaning of words be, let's say, 75% wrong, and it still be the case that I'm capable of conversing with people and, in the thought experiment's case, understanding genetic evidence? Can I read a paper from genetics and be wrong about the meaning of 75% of the words and still comprehend what it's saying about the XX mutation? That seems to be hard for me to understand.
So I don't mean to overcome. So it's kind of funny because like a lot of these arguments sort of like have all these metaphysics in the background and theories of semantics and other things. Um, so it's gonna depend on how you understand meaning. So if we take,
Yeah.
so right, so I didn't want to get into like all these other discussions, which are probably like important to evaluate the argument. But you're saying something like, if your cognitive faculties were unreliable, you couldn't read and understand the paper.
If they were that
Um,
unreliable, yes, that's what
I
I'm
don't
saying.
think it's going to entail that you can't read and understand the paper, but that you can that you can read the paper and understand it, construe it correctly is going to be very, very low. I think that's going to be the idea.
But Plantinga is saying we've just done that though. That's what I'm asking. Like, how does that fit with having such unreliable cognitive faculties?
Oh, so it's planting. Are you saying something like, how could you even read and understand the argument if your cognitive faculties was low? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay, I see. Well, I don't think planting. Well, see, I don't think Plantinga is saying that your cognitive faculties are low. He's just saying that you're irrational in believing that you're irrational in rejecting that, given that you believe in naturalism and evolution.
Well, I'm trying to make sense of the thought experiment, right? Reading here, the aforementioned scientific argumentation says that given naturalism and evolution, it is likely that the double X mutation rendered everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable. Okay, now if it follows from our cognitive faculties being generally unreliable that I could not even understand and make sense of a paper which said that the XX mutation rendered them unreliable, then that's just an obvious and straightforward defeater of the conclusion of that paper. So I would say, well, no, the XX mutation did not render my cognitive faculties unreliable to the degree that I can't understand what the paper says, because I just read and understood the paper.
Okay, so you read the
so
paper.
Maybe I'm just rejecting this thought experiment as being irrelevant. I don't know, but I just don't find this persuasive for this reason. Well,
why can it be the case that so let's say that you have the mutation. Why couldn't it be the case? So you read the paper and then you form the belief that you understood the paper. Why couldn't that belief be false?
Sorry, which belief?
So you have the mutation, you read the paper, you interpret the paper. Obviously, when you read, you interpret what the intention of the author of the paper said, and you believe this and this and this is what the author meant, and then you come to believe that you understood the paper correctly, or you understood most of it. Now, why couldn't that belief be false? Why couldn't most of those beliefs that you just formed there be false?
Oh, my belief about understanding the paper.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess this comes back to the nature of what we think about justification, right? Could you think that you systematically understood language? Let's take it out of one specific paper, because obviously you could misunderstand a particular paper. But could you think that you systematically understood language and then not? It just doesn't make sense to me. Like, what does that look like? This seems to be something that makes sense only in a thought experiment, but when you try to cash it out, it just doesn't. Like, there are people who have language aphasias, right? It's a little bit hard to. I mean, we don't really know what their internal sort of phenomenology is like, I suppose. But your screen just went blank. I don't know if that was deliberate.
No, sorry. Let me just.
But I mean, like, if someone has Wernicke's aphasia, for example, which is a form of aphasia where people can produce speech that sort of sounds fluent but doesn't really make any sense. That's maybe that's helpful. That's sort of what I'm imagining when I think about someone in Plantinga's world of systematically unreliable cognitive faculties. That their speech is just kind of like mostly gibberish, because they're not capable of sort of expressing, or at least there may be internal speech or something. I don't know. They're not capable of expressing ideas that that sort of correspond to anything. Because if they were, it seems that there's a subset of their beliefs that are sort of systematically corresponding to something, right? But then if you're in that position, I just don't know. I don't know. I guess you could say, look, it's like a skeptical scenario where you just somehow constantly think that people understand you when they don't. But that's not what the thought experiment says. The thought experiment S5, the one we're just looking at, says it just imagines that it's kind of like the world we're in, except you just read a paper that says, hey, actually, everyone has this mutation, which makes their cognitive faculties unreliable. And you sort of think, what should I think about that? If Plantinga is going to ask me, what do you think about that thought experiment? I would just say, Well, look, if that was the entailment of the paper, that the paper would say that my cognitive faculties are so unreliable, then I would say that's a reason not to believe the paper, the findings of the paper, that is, because it just seems like I probably wouldn't be able to make any sense of it under the hypothesis.
Well, no, what they
So-
would say is that given that you understand the paper and given all these other things, that's going to be a reason to reject naturalism and evolution. Because where naturalism and evolution to be true, the probability that you understood the paper is going to be extremely low. So the fact that you do understand the paper is going to be a reason against naturalism and evolution.
Yeah, but the thought experiment presupposes that I've understood the paper. It says it as part of it.
Wait, so let's just go through it again. I come to believe in the
Hang on,
following.
I got to bring it up again.
Yeah, so I come to believe in the following: via a nifty combination of scientific and philosophical argumentation, it is proven beyond all reasonable doubt that naturalistic evolution entails the XX mutation. So let's say we have some arguments that shows that naturalism and evolution entail XX mutation. The aforementioned scientific and philosophical argumentation says that given N and E, it is likely that the XX mutation rendered everyone's cognitive faculties unreliable. Though on N and E, there is also the small chance that everyone evolved the blocking gene to render everyone's immune to drug XX. For some reason, he keeps jumping from drug XX to XX mutation. So I think this is just.
I find that confusing. That's why I
I think
to
this
leave
is just,
that to the side.
This is Maverick, by the way, and not Planzinger. And this I think it's just a draft. So I think he just means mutation here. N and E. So the idea is supposed to be that through science and philosophy, we come to find that N and E entail XX mutation, and that XX mutation renders your cognitive faculties very low. But it's also the case that given N and E, there is a low probability. It's not it's not like a logical entailment, but there's a low probability that we have some kind of a blocking gene. N and E entailing that the XX mutation is part of our genetics thus makes P, R, and E low. So it's because N and E entail XX mutation, and XX mutation makes it such that R being reliable is very low. That's why given N and E, R is going to be low. And I thus come to believe R given N and E is low. I believe sometime after it is discovered that drug XX entered our bloodstream, credible scientists have run cognitive tests to confirm that we have the blocking gene. So I think the idea is supposed to be that after we believe all of this, we see the entailment and everything, and we come to believe that R given N and E is low, that then scientists discover that we human beings have the blocking gene. But since this belief came long after the drug, again, this is a typo, entered my bloodstream, it seems that likely scenario S4, this would be evidence for my cognitive reliability is undermined by drug XX. My belief I have the XX mutation defeats R. So I think the idea here is that you formed this belief before the scientists made the discovery. And that's why this belief blocks you from conditionalizing over the discoveries of the scientists. So I think that's supposed to be the idea.
I formed which belief before the discoveries?
This belief. That you have the XX mutation. Can you see my mouse, by the way?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. My belief that you have the mutation defeats R, which is reliability of cognitive faculties for me, just as it does. Well, let's leave the scenario 4 for the moment. My belief that I have the mutation defeats R for me. Well, I guess I'm just really thinking about cognitive faculties in a really different way. It really seems that Plantinga is thinking about them as if they're sort of these functions that spit out beliefs that are either true or not.
Yes,
and that just seems wrong to me. So let me cash that out just to try to explain that a bit more. If I say I have my belief that I have the XX mutation. So I'm going to stop right there and say, what is the necessary cognitive apparatus that you would have to even form that belief? And I'm going to say it's more than it seems that Plantinga wants to allow us to have, given naturalism. Because how can you even form that belief unless you have a whole set of interwoven beliefs about what it means to have a mutation, say, and reliability? This is kind of what I'm saying about the nature of sort of knowledge and how it works. If I'm capable of understanding those concepts and like reading papers and other things, talking to people, then it seems like I must have a lot more knowledge than Plantinga is sort of stating that we can have in that thought experiment. So I think that there's a tension in the way that the thought experiment, at least from my way of thinking about these things, try to set up the situation where it's sort of like it says that we can't have the knowledge because like our faculties are unreliable, but we're also reading and talking and forming beliefs about stuff. It seems to me that we have no business doing any of that under the assumption that so much of our faculties are unreliable. I just don't even think we'd be able to do that.
Okay, I see I see. So there's this other objection that I have, which runs similar to you, and it's supposed to be the idea that it's in the idea. Once we carry out some kind of a conceptual analysis on agency, it's in the notion of agency that our cognitive faculties are reliable. So we couldn't be agents without our cognitive faculties being reliable. I assume that's how you're thinking here as well, right?
I don't know about agency per se, but it sounds like it's along those lines.
Yeah, so you're saying something like we couldn't engage in things like communication. So a precondition for communication is that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Is that the idea?
So that's close. Again, I'm just working this out for myself as well. So I'm not saying I've sort of worked out all the details, but that's, the point of this discussion, right? We're just sort of thinking through it. I think the whole notion of cognitive faculties being reliable or unreliable is ill-formed. That's sort of my main thesis that I'm trying to get across. And I'm sort of thinking about ways in which I can sort of explain that or cash that out or how that works. And so one aspect there would be to say that if we're capable of, let's say, entertaining the proposition that we have this mutation, that in itself presupposes, it requires a very complex and intricate set of cognitive faculties that have to work in a specific way. Now, whether they're reliable or not, I'm going to put to the side for the moment, because again, I think that language just doesn't even really make sense. But it presupposes a lot about the way our minds work, let's say. And it seems that Plantinga doesn't want us to have that. But at the same time, he wants us to be able to at least entertain beliefs of that sort. So that's part of where I'm drawing the tension. And maybe you can add things as well there. It's not just beliefs, it's about communication. Maybe it's about agency as well. So maybe there's a lot there. But in the thought experiment specifically, he talked about entertaining a belief, which I don't think we'd even be able to entertain if our cognitive faculties were the sort of way that Plantinga seems to think that they would be, given naturalism.
Okay, I see what you mean. Can you see my screen, by the way?
No, I don't see it now.
Okay, I see. I'm just running something in the background, so it seems like when I do that, my computer stops streaming. But so I think the idea what Plantinga is trying to say is like he's interested in talking about. So this argument is sort of shows that N and D are self-defeating, right? That's supposed to be the conclusion of the argument.
Yeah.
And self-defeating there is supposed to be a rational notion, and the type of rationality Plantinga again, like there's going to be a multitude of notions of rationality, and maybe like you have you think of rationality different than Plantinga does, but Plantinga thinks of rationality in a doxastic way. So rationality for him is supposed to be something like there isn't a tension between your beliefs that are part of your noetic structure. It's not like you believe in two things that in conjunction entail a contradiction, because if you do, then you'd be like irrational or something. And the idea is supposed to be that, look, and also another idea is supposed to be that your beliefs need to be mostly true for you to be like a rational agent or something like that. And if you're not a rational agent, then your belief producing mechanism is not working, is not reliable. So that's how he's thinking about it. And what he's saying is all those other things about connected to your cognitive faculties, beliefs and communication and language and other those things, those are fine, but we're only interested in whether your cognitive faculties are working correctly with respect to belief production.
Yes. Okay. I think that seems right from what he said. Sorry, you continue.
Yeah. So, and he's saying that, look, if it was the case that naturalism and evolution are true, then that your cognitive faculties would be functioning correct with respect to your doxastic states, to your beliefs, would be very low. And if you believe that, then that would give you a defeater for all of your beliefs. Because now, what is it the case? Now you're believing that your cognitive there's a very little chance that your cognitive faculties are producing true beliefs.
And if you believe that, then you have no reason to believe that any of your beliefs in your noetic structure are true, because all of those are going to be a product of your cognitive faculties. And once you believe that, you have a defeater for all of your beliefs, including N and D. So that's supposed to be the idea. Now, it sounds like to me what you're saying is one thing could be that you're saying that, look, all of this stuff with like belief production and so on, that's not what cognitive faculties do. They're not like they're not some kind of a function where you input like data from your environment and then the output is beliefs. The other thing that you might be saying is something like, look, it's just going to be a precondition for communication that our cognitive faculties are reliable. And so if it's the case that we do communicate, then R has to be true. And if R has to be true, then this argument doesn't go through or something. Like I couldn't even come to know of this argument unless my cognitive faculties were. So I'm not entirely sure what line of thinking you're going, but those are like two ways I seem to be understanding it.
Yeah, that's helpful. So let's explore that a bit more. So I want to come back to saying that I think fundamentally I don't think it's well. Okay, well, no, maybe I should back away from that, because you are specifying it fairly tightly, that for our cognitive faculty to be unreliable, we're specifically talking about the faculty of our beliefs being true or not, and that most of them will be false. Most of our beliefs will be false. And we're only referring to that aspect of our cognition, not other aspects like being able to form the beliefs in the first place or communicating them or other things like that. So that's what is meant by unreliable. Okay, our cognitive faculties being generally unreliable. And I think, okay, so given that, yeah, because that was one thing that I was a bit unclear about. What exactly is he and is he not claiming? So given that that's the conception, I think what I'm saying is that I think that it doesn't really, well, I guess I could say it doesn't really make sense. But the thing is, I'm conditioning there on my understanding of evolution and a bunch of other things. Let me just say, given what I believe about the world, it doesn't really make sense for me to say that we could have that our beliefs could be systematically wrong in the way that we're talking about, but we could still be able to form beliefs in this way and communicate them and other things. So I think it's closer to what you were saying, that reliability is a precondition for, say, communication. Although I wouldn't quite say it that way, but basically, I just think that we have existing defeaters that it's extremely unlikely that our cognitive faculties will be unreliable in the way that Plantinga thinks about it, given other things that we sort of straightforwardly know, such as the fact that we're able to entertain certain beliefs and communicate them to other people. Because I don't think that if we sort of reduce it down, I don't think that distinction that Plantinga wants to make actually sort of works cognitively or psychologically. Like you can conceptually separate them, but that doesn't actually mean that they work differently. And so what I'm saying is I don't think that it's very likely at all that Plantinga can get what he wants whilst retaining the ability to even form the ideas, like form the beliefs and communicate them. I just don't think that's how it works, and I think that's very implausible.
So let's just agree on like the phraseology that you want to use for what you believe. If you don't like the whole precondition, because what I think it might be the case that sort of we've been like talking past each other a bit, because it seems like what you're taking issue with, or sort of what you have in mind, is sort of an objection to the first premise of the EANE. Because if you're saying something like, because like, look, what's the E supposed to be in NND? E is supposed to be evolution. Evolution of what? Evolution of human beings. And it's sort of in the concept of human beings that we like engage in. Can you still hear me, by the way?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to bring up the argument again.
So it's supposed to be evolution of human beings, and you're just saying something like human beings are. It's in their concept that they're like beings that communicate or something along those lines. And so, if evolution produced human beings like us, then evolution couldn't have produced us with like R being low. Is that what you had in mind?
Yeah, this is what I was saying before, that I don't. So now that I think I have a bit of a grasp of what Plantinga is saying when he says R, one's cognitive faculties are reliable, I think that it just really can't be the case, or very unlikely to be the case, that we can have our cognitive faculties be unreliable in the way that Plantinga wants it to, whilst preserving what I could say preserving the phenomenology, which means that we're still able to form the ideas that we form and communicate them.
Okay, I
So
see.
I'm sort of conditioning on that as well.
Okay, I see. So it seems like to me that one way to interpret what you're saying is you're taking problems with the what we call the probability thesis or the probability premise. So it seems like what you're saying is you don't think that evolution and naturalism renders R low. If we just take those two and those two alone, we don't conditionalize upon anything else.
Hang
Or
on.
would you
If we just take what alone?
evolution and naturalism alone?
And what are we not allowed to conditionalize on?
No, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying that if we were to conditionalize upon those two and those two alone, do you think R would be low or not low?
So our one's cognitive faculties being reliable in the way that Plantinga thinks about it.
Unreliable in the way he thinks about it, yeah.
Yeah, unreliable. I actually haven't the foggiest idea, right? Because I don't even know if our faculties are reliable in the way that Plantinga thinks about it. In the idea that more than 75% of the propositions that we form are true. Like, I don't know if that's even true, irrespective of evolution or not. Like, I don't. Has anyone tested that? Like, how would you even know such a thing?
I don't think that's like even testable.
Well, so that's part of my problem, right? How can you even know? I interpret Plantinga to be making a stronger claim that under naturalism, it would like almost all of our beliefs would be false. And if that's the case, I would say no. I don't think that follows from evolution. But I don't know what the percentage would be.
Well, you see, the thing with like Plantinga is sort of like what he's saying is sort of like complicated. Well, I mean, it's not complicated, but it's going to overcomplicate the discussion. But his idea is supposed to be something like, given naturalism and evolution, the most likely view is going to be materialism. And given materialism and N and E, the most likely view of the mind is epiphenomenalism, semantic epiphenomenalism. And he's even willing to say, look, if it was the case that the so he makes a distinction between the sort of like the neurological properties of beliefs and the content of your beliefs, like under some view. So let's say that your beliefs are, some physical state in your brain, but they also have another properties. They have conceptual properties. Let's just say that that's the proposition. So for example, that let's say that you believe it's raining outside. So that's going to have a physical component to it, which is going to be what we can call the NP properties, but it's going to have the conceptual properties, which is just a proposition, it's raining outside. And what Plantinga is saying is that, look, if it's the propositional part, the content part, if that can enter into the causal chain that produces behavior, he's willing to say, look, your cognitive faculties being reliable can be very high. I'm willing to grant that it's very high. But what's going to be doing work in my argument for the first premise is that given N and E and materialism, the most likely view of the mind, and I think he assigns it a probability of 0.7, whereas he assigns the other view that the content can enter into the causal part like 0.3. He says, given that it just epiphenomenalism is the most likely view, it's still going to follow that R is low. That's what he says about the first premise.
So this is Plantinga you're talking about here.
Yeah, this is Plantinga. This is, you can find this in the, he has this unpublished paper called Naturalism Defeated, but you also can find it in the first paper to this other collection of theses called Naturalism Defeated ? So he has the same title except for in the collection it has a question mark in the end.
Because I've read one of his papers on this, but I don't recall him giving probabilities there. But anyway, yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, okay. So I know Maverick Christian, I think in his version does talk about the epiphenomenalism aspect a lot. Do you think that, and I still need to think more about that. Do you think that that's critical for the argument?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Because because if it was the case that, because if that wasn't the case, that if the epiphenomenalism thing wasn't the case, why would you accept that R is low in N and E?
Yeah, exactly. I think that this is the issue. So just to clarify here, let's make sure that I'm on the same page as you and that our audience is on the same page. So when we say epiphenomenalism, we're talking about epiphenomenalism of mental states. Is that right?
Yeah, so the idea is just supposed to
Yeah.
be that so epiphenomenalism will just be the idea that beliefs can be effects, but they can't be causes.
Yeah.
Whereas semantical epiphenomenalism is that the beliefs can be effects and causes, but but beliefs qua causes are gonna do the causing in virtue of their physical properties, not in virtue of their semantical properties.
Yes. And
So
so,
So
sorry, go ahead.
imagine, yeah, so just imagine something like, let's say that you throw a green brick at a window and the window breaks, right? It's still going to be that the cause of the breaking is going to be the brick, but the
Mhm.
brick broke the window in virtue of its like mass, like mass, not in virtue of its color. Like sort of the color is sort of
Yeah.
like we can say is epiphenomenal there.
Right. Relative to the
Yeah,
breaking of the window. Yeah. So
right.
the idea here would be that our behavior, which is what evolution selects for, um, well, behaviors that lead to better survival outcomes, right? So our behaviors are caused by brain states. But
Hmm.
if beliefs and mental content more generally is epiphenomenal, then our beliefs cannot stand in causal relations to our behavior. And therefore, there's
Right.
no way that natural selection could have purchase on our beliefs.
Right. So what Plantinga says is, look, if it's the case that beliefs are epiphenomenal, either in the semantical sense or just the simple sense,
Mm.
then it's not. Then evolution is sort of blind to the content of your beliefs,
Yeah.
and so that the probability, the truth value for each of your belief, we're just going to have to apply what is known as the principle of indifference, which is just sort of supposed to be the idea that if you have a multitude of propositions that are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, meaning that if one is true, the rest is false, and one of them has to be true, and we don't have any evidence for either of the options, then the way we assign probabilities by dividing one by the number of alternatives. And since values can have true truth value, it's binary. That means that for each belief, we can only assign a 0.5, sorry, a 50% chance that the belief is true. And since we need for our cognitive faculties to be reliable, at least 75% is true. The likelihood that 75% of your beliefs are reliable given the principle of indifference is like 0.000, something very low. He
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
calculation in the paper.
Of course. Yeah.
I'm like shit at math, so I can't like
Yeah, I
rerun
haven't
that.
read
But
this particular paper. I must have read a different version where he
it's
doesn't
the
go into that
first,
detail.
yeah, it's the first paper in the collection Naturalism Defeated question mark. If you want to check it out after the
Yeah, well,
discussion.
I'll have to get to that. There's so many things to read. Right now, I'm working through the oh blast, what's their name? The McGrew's paper and the Blackwell companion on the Bayesian analysis of the resurrection for a video I'm doing with Nathan
Oh,
tomorrow.
I
So
see, I
that
see.
there's always things. Yeah, but I'll have to get to that. But yeah, so this is actually interesting because I think that is that argument makes sense to me as a reason why premise one would be true, right? If you think that beliefs are epiphenomenal, because then then there's basically no reason why they would be shaped by evolution to be anything in particular. One question I have for you that I don't know the answer to, under Plantinga's view, so if he thinks beliefs are epiphenomenal, then why does he think that our beliefs track reality? Like what is it that
Oh, but he doesn't think that. He's just saying that if you're a
under
naturalist in
naturalism they
evolution, yeah, that's the position you should adopt.
okay, but what is his position then?
Oh, I think he's some kind of a dualist or something. So he's probably going to be
Uh,
open that content can enter into causal relations. He's just saying that look, given materialism, he doesn't see how
yeah, right. So I understand that, but I mean, I don't know about Plantinga's view because I don't understand it well enough here. That the problem that I've encountered elsewhere is that sometimes, and Plantinga is probably more careful than others, so maybe he's thought about this. But sometimes there's a problem that's adduced for one worldview, which is not actually avoided by alternative worldviews. Like if you're going to say that this problem for naturalism, I'm immediately asking, well, how does postulating non-natural entities get you out of this problem? And does it actually get you out of this problem? Because if it doesn't, then that could potentially be a reductio against what the problem is supposed to be if actually no one has a solution for it. So that's why I'm kind of interested into what does Plantinga think that not
Okay, I
being a
see.
naturalist does to get you out of this problem of our beliefs not having causal
So I think
effects.
yeah. So the type of objection you're running, and I do run a similar, is known as sort of like a Chukotay objection. So you're not saying
Yeah,
that look,
yeah.
there's anything wrong in the argument. You're just saying that look, if we were to just shift out the premise of naturalism with theism, the same conclusion would still follow. So if this is a problem for me, then it's a problem for you too. But I think the problem there doesn't come from Plantinga's view of the mind, the content part. I think sort of the problem comes that given theism, that R is still going to be low given just theism and evolution. And the only way for R to go high is for Plantinga to introduce Christianity into the conjunction. So it's going to be theism, Christianity, and evolution that's going to render R high, because Christianity is going to include things like God created us in his image and so on. And so God is rational. And since we're created in his image, we're going to be rational too. And then I'm just going to ask, look, why is it the case that you get to conditionalize over Christianity? Like, why can't the naturalist just conditionalize over something like, this is our evolutionary history, this is how we evolved, or something,
Yes,
something,
exactly.
or like reliable evolution or something like that. And so it's unfair that you get to conditionalize over Christianity and the naturalist doesn't. So that's the way I think the Christian falls prey to the argument as well. I don't think it's because of the epiphenomenalism aspect.
Yeah, that's it. I need to think about that a little bit more, because I agree with what you said about the problem of putting Christianity in there and conditioning on more. I'm still interested in terms of how Plantinga thinks about what God, how God affects mental content. Let me put it that way, because I don't know that accounts that I've read really make a lot of sense there. But that'll take us maybe further afield than we want to get to in this discussion. But yeah, that's gives me something more to think about there. So maybe to come back to this argument here. So we've talked about how premise one is largely, it seems, supported on the basis of epiphenomenalism of our beliefs, which I reject. And also, I parenthetically say, I don't know. I mean, I kind of work in this area now, or at least trying to get a PhD here. And I don't really know of any sort of cognitive psychologists or neuroscientists or anyone working in this area who thinks that our beliefs don't cause things. So I really think that view is kind of a non-starter, although Plantinga is maybe just going to say, well, the naturalist has to bite that bullet or whatever. But that's just not very persuasive to me as a premise, at least. So then if we look at,
right.
Oh, sorry, if you wanted to comment on that,
I think it's Evan Faley's was a paper in the same collection, Naturalism, where he makes this point that if the content of our beliefs, because he says, look, the mind and the belief system and so on, this is very like energy taxing, right? It's sort of like very expensive, right, to have something like like a belief system. And so he's saying that if content didn't enter into our belief system, it will be very unlikely that we would have evolved that system. So he runs that type of an objection.
Interesting.
And so he says that it's not the case that he says that epiphenomenalism would be low given naturalism and evolution. It wouldn't be very high, unlike what Plantinga says.
Interesting.
Was that what you had in mind?
Well, that's one way of getting to the argument. I don't actually even think you need to make an evolutionary argument for it, although I think that I would agree with what you said there. Yeah, so lots of problems with one from my point of view, premise one here. Let's look at the other ones as well. So we talked about the person who believes naturalism and evolution and sees that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable is low has a defeater for the belief that our cognitive faculties are reliable.
That's right there.
So the thought experiments that we were going through, is that supposed to establish 2 or 3 here?
2.
It's supposed to establish 2. Oh,
let me know
because
if
that's
you
the
want me to
series
stream them. If you want me to stream them again. Yeah, just let me know if you want me to stream them again.
No, that's all right. I think I'm just trying to fit together the sort of overall argument here. So yeah, so those series of thought experiments that we were just talking about are supposed to establish this here, the defeater idea here. Okay, so coming back to that, now that I think I've got a clear idea of what cognitive faculties are reliable, I'm still not sure if I buy those series of thought experiments for some of the reasons that I said before, such as that there's so much going on there and I don't necessarily trust my intuitions about them. And I don't think I actually have to play the game of starting at the first one and going through them. I can disagree with the last one and say that at some point I disagree, but don't necessarily know where. But maybe, yeah, I don't know that I have too much more to say about those other than I just find them unnecessarily labored.
So I think that was like sort of what I was trying to talk about in the beginning, because I sort of try to avoid, again, like, I'm like very new to this argument. So like, for one, it's not something you find apology. I'm sort of like my background is sort of like in the Kalam,
Right.
and so I'm used to those styles of arguments. And so this
Mm.
one, I haven't thought about it too much, but it seems like my favorite strategy is to go after the second premise, not the first one, because in the first one, sort of like the empirics gets messy. What is it exactly that current evolutionary theory says?
Sure.
Would this? So I'm just willing to grant. Let's just grant them the first premise. And what I'm saying is, look, the XX drug thought experiment. We can grant that in some scenarios, it's going to be sufficiently analogous to believing in N and E, such that in those cases, if you do believe in N and E, you have a defeater. But it's not gonna render that believing in N and D simplicator gives you a defeater. And
Yes.
the reason why I'm saying that is because I just have like straightforward thought experiments from just like everyday cases, which are more analogous, which are sort of more closer to some scenarios of believing in ND, which I think most people who are like philosophically minded are going to end up adopting NNE in that fashion than that are closer to the XX drug example. So here's an idea, right? Let's say that you believe. So this is a thought experiment. You believe that this machine right here is unreliable. It's like a horrible machine at telling you the state of your cognitive faculties. And you take the test of the machine, and the machine tells you that your cognitive faculties are unreliable. Now, who in the right mind would say now you have a defeater for R? Do you understand the
Yeah.
thought?
Yeah. Exactly.
Right, right. But it's still going to be the case that if the machine is, let's just say that the machine also determines that your cognitive faculties have been unreliable from birth, like from before you even formed any of your
Mm.
belief. I just assume tabula rasa for the sake of argument. I don't think much charge in that. But
Yeah.
the idea that you're not born with any beliefs, like all of your beliefs are like, but in that case, nobody in the right mind would say that a defeater has been formed. But look at the properties. Of the thought experiment. One, the negative effects would have taken place before any of your beliefs have been formed. But still, a defeater isn't generated. And we would all agree that we can conditionalize upon the belief that the machine is unreliable, right? It's not like I can come and now, after you've seen the result of the machine, you believe that the machine says your cognitive faculties are unreliable, and I say, hey, you can't conditionalize upon the belief that the machine is unreliable because you only formed that belief after you were born. So that after like the negative effects which the machine is reporting has taken place. Are you tracking this, by the way? Because I said like a lot there, but it's very important that you get all the details here.
Yeah. Just keep going. Keep going.
Yeah. So like what Maverick and Planting a Soda seem to want to capitalize on is the idea that the bad effects, let's just call it the bad effects of XX drug or the mutation, have taken place before belief formation. Right? Are you getting that part? That the negative effects. This is what he says. He says that,
Yeah.
but
That's what we were
yeah,
talking about before.
yeah,
Analogous to evolution.
yeah, and I'm saying that even that property can't be what generates the defeater because that property is true here. The unreliable machine is saying that your cognitive faculties have been unreliable from birth. But given that you believe that the machine is extremely unreliable, a defeater isn't generated, even if that property is true. So what other properties are true in the case of the XX drug or the XX mutations that are not true in the thought experiment that I just gave? And I'm saying that this thought experiment that I just gave with the machine seems to be close to the scenario that I gave before. You don't believe in evolution or naturalism. You have a third proposition that you do believe in. You see that R is low given just evolution and naturalism, but you see that R is high given naturalism, evolution, and this third belief that you have. And then through independent evidence, you come to believe in naturalism and evolution. In that case, I would say even if we grant all of the thought experiments involving the drug and the mutation, it would still not follow. They would still not entail that in that scenario, the feeder is generated because those thought experiments don't entail that in the case of the unreliable machine, a defeater is generated. And if the machine case doesn't generate a defeater, the case that I just gave of believing in naturalism and evolution doesn't generate a defeater. So that's the objection that I'm running against the argument.
So how is your thought experiment different to his S5 case, say, where you find out about a study that says we've all got this gene that makes our cognitive faculties unreliable. It sounds like you're saying pretty much what he says in that thought experiment.
Okay. So here is the difference, right? In the one case, one is ex ante and the other is ex post. So the idea is just that in his thought experiment, sort of like the evidence against is you only come to believe in the evidence against after you form the belief of the mutation. Whereas the one that I gave you, the
Yep.
belief is present before.
Hang on, I got to get this right. So which belief is present before what?
Okay, so in his example, you
Yep.
come first to believe that you have the mutation, and then you come to believe in evidence against the mutation. But since the evidence was gathered after you formed the belief, the evidence can't count in favor of your cognitive faculties are reliable. But in my thought experiment, the evidence, you believed in the evidence prior to coming and finding out about the drug.
You believed in the evidence for what?
So, in here's his example, right? You read the paper, you find
Yep.
out about the mutation, then after you form the belief that there's a mutation, and
Yep.
then the scientists come and tell you, "Hey, we just discovered that you have the blocking gene."
Yep.
But the time, the temporal aspect is important because you only got that evidence after you formed the belief, and that's why.
After you formed the belief that you had a mutation which made your cognitive faculties unreliable.
Yeah. After. Whereas in the example that I gave, take the machine part where you take your test and the machine is unreliable. You had the belief that the machine is extremely unreliable before you let the machine test your cognitive faculties.
Right, but what if we don't have any? Well, actually, I guess we could change it. So what if I believe that the machine is reliable, but then I see that it tells me that I don't have reliable cognitive faculties? So it seems to me that I would then conclude that the machine actually wasn't reliable in the first place.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so like Planting or Maverick would reject that. They would say, look, if you believe that the machine was reliable, and it told you that your cognitive faculties are unreliable, they would then tell you that adopting that belief, you can't reason out of it, because any form of reasoning is going to take into usage your cognitive faculties.
Yeah, but why would I? So suppose I have someone who I think generally tells the truth and is generally reliable in what they tell me, and then they come home one day and tell me that I don't know, aliens landed in the city and abducted people, and all sorts of other, not like dragons came and burned people up, and they said all this stuff, and they said it really happened, like it wasn't a movie or something like that. Would I just believe them? Well, no, I would not believe them, and then I would lower my credence in anything that they told me after that, right? So why wouldn't I respond the same way to reading a paper or getting the results of a machine that said, actually, like, your cognitive faculties are systematically unreliable?
Okay, I see what you mean. I guess it's just built in the thought experiment that it's a trusting source, the machine, because look, you can run the same thing with the thought experiments. Like, why believe the doctor, right?
Well, yeah, this is sort of what I mean. Like, I think it's kind of, well, I don't know, maybe I don't know if it's getting to the
Why
same point
believe
that
the
you're
paper?
raising, but
Why believe the paper?
what are we allowed to condition on is sort of the question here, it seems to me.
Right.
If we already have other reasons for thinking that our cognitive faculties are reliable, or at least to some degree reliable, then if this then other piece of evidence comes out that said that from which it follows that they're not, it seems to me going to disbelieve that or downweight it or something.
So what you're saying is,
and that seems entirely rational to me.
So what you're saying is sort of something like this. You're saying, why take the results of the machine as a defeater for my cognitive faculties and not take my cognitive faculties as a defeater for the reliability of the machine?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah, so, okay, I see. Yeah, I mean, I don't think they have an answer to that, because remember, they don't have, and Plantinga admits this, he doesn't have an answer to the conditionalizing problem. So the only way he tries to generate the defeater is by analogy of thought experiments.
Yeah, right.
And I don't think the argument goes through unless they have a solution to the conditionalizing problem. Because one, you can. What do you do in the case of a clash of intuitions, right? What if I say my intuition just doesn't say there's a defeater here, and his intuition says that, well, there is a defeater here, right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of the line of thought experiments there, because I feel like it's trying to get me to provide an intuitive judgment sort of reaction to the thought experiment. But I'm very skeptical to those sort of reactions. So even if I react in a certain way to the thought experiment, say, then at a meta level, I'm going to say, well, just because I have this intuitive reaction to it doesn't actually mean that that's the sort of the correct answer. So that's one of the reasons I was, as I said at the outset, kind of like, well, I don't really want to play this game and walk through them, because even if I agree with him intuitively, I don't necessarily accept that as like
I
the
see
right
what you're
answer.
saying. Have you heard in epistemology of the term non-inferential justification?
Yes,
Yeah. So
yes.
like you know about like positions like foundationalism and coherentism, right?
Yeah.
So like foundationalists sort of like coherentists sort of reject. Well, I don't want to say all coherentists. There's also like exceptions, obviously, but coherentists are sort of not very happy about the idea of non-inferential justification. That you can be justified in believing a proposition without having an inference to it. And it sounds like what you're saying is you agree that there is no such thing as non-inferential justification. And so even if you grant that, look, I do have the intuition about all of these thought experiments, but that intuition is not a reason for belief. And given that that's not the reason for belief, I have no reason to accept the second premise of the EAAN in the absence of some inference.
Yeah, I mean, I lean towards coherentism. I had a recent debate on this actually on my channel, but yeah, I don't know whether I would go so far as to say there's no such thing as non-inferential justification. That's a pretty bold claim to me, but I would say that my intuitive reaction to thought experiments, especially fairly complicated ones like these, I don't take to be well. Ironically, I don't take that cognitive faculty to be reliable, right? So I would say that it doesn't. I just want to clarify. It doesn't follow from that analogies and thought experiments cannot be useful. It's just that I would say that an intuitive reaction or judgment made on the basis of responding to them without very careful analysis and other sorts of tools is not in itself that informative. So that's why I want to say, well, look, if actually this thought experiment entails something that I think is ridiculous, then that actually gives me reason to not trust whatever intuitive reaction I initially had. Because I would think that my working through the logical implications of it is perhaps more reliable than just a sort of an intuitive judgment about a hypothetical situation, if you see what I mean. So I'm going to want to take a sort of an all things considered perspective on judging these sort of thought experiments, and not just consider it sort of on its own light, because I don't really think anyone's very good at judging those sorts of things.
I see. So it sounds like you're doing some kind of a Morian shift. So the idea is supposed to be something like, if this thought experiment holds, then your cognitive faculty is unreliable. And instead of granting the antecedent, you're rejecting the consequent, which would make the antecedent false. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so that's what I sort of said at the outset about about rejecting one of the final steps.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Where you said you don't have to point out exactly where the problem is, but as long as the conclusion is false, somewhere it has to go somewhere. The error must be there in somewhere, but you don't have to point it out.
Yeah, if I have reason for rejecting the conclusion, then I mean, I think that that's just as justified as perceiving the other way, and I think I could argue that it's more justified. And then we could talk about how valuable these sort of experiments are, and I'm generally sort of skeptical about them.
Okay, I see what you mean. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you say, but sort of like the way I like to do philosophy of religion is that sort of like, just imagine the kalam, right? Like if the B theory is true, then the kalam doesn't go through, and like A theory is like very controversial. It's not like a very popular view, and you could just end the discussion there. But I like to be charitable and like grant as much like of the background as possible, and just
I see what you're saying.
show like even if I grant you all of this, and sort of that's like what I'm doing with the EAN. I'm saying like, look, I grant you the probability. I grant you that thought experiments can be used as can be reasons for belief, and all of that. But still, the argument doesn't go through because these thought experiments don't entail, even if we grant that they generate defeaters, don't entail the defeater thesis. At least not the S1 to S4 don't. And the reason is because of all these other thought experiments here, such as the machine one, where
all the same properties seem to be present that you're trying to capitalize on, but nevertheless a defeater isn't generated.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think that our approach is somewhat similar in sort of adding things to condition on in the thought experiment. But and as you say, then Plantinga sort of doesn't necessarily have a good response to what you're allowed to condition on and what you're not allowed to. One thing I would like to add to that is I don't like. I mean, generally, I'm a fan of granting things for the sake of argument to try to get at the most interesting aspect of the argument. Maybe where I would differ is when I'm not a big fan of playing thought experiment games, and by that I mean responding to a thought experiment with another thought experiment that attempts to show that there's a difference, because it seems that I mean, maybe this is just a dispositional thing. I don't know that I can give a sort of a clear argument as to that this is sort of bad across the board, but because there's always an opportunity then to come up with yet another thought experiment that draws a distinction that you wanted to make there. And the Kalam's an interesting example here because of paradoxes or paradoxes and thought experiments that are used to attempt to show that there can't be like the causal finitism must be true, or the kind of actual infinities or something like that. And there it seems to me that it's just, well, it's not just, but a lot of the literature is a series of providing thought experiments and then counter thought experiments and then further refined thought experiments. And I don't actually think that this is a very helpful way in general of pursuing philosophy. So I just don't like doing philosophy that way, I suppose. And I guess I acknowledge a lot of literature is about doing that, but I personally think that that's
ethics is like almost exclusively doing that.
Well, yeah, like trolley problems would be an interesting example of that, right? Because I think that the basic forms are kind of helpful as ways of refining and thinking about our intuitions and entailments of views. But the more complicated and intricate things get, I don't know, I just tend to find that they become so divorced from anything that's like actually plausible in reality. I feel like that our intuitions become less and less plausibly reliable about them, and that it's just less and less clear to me what purpose that they're trying to serve. Anyway, I guess, I mean, one could differ on that, but this is just one of the reasons why I don't like playing thought experiment games. Because for your thought experiment, there's someone cleverer who can think up a better thought experiment. And then at the end of the day, if you just have clashing intuitions on a thought experiment, well, what can you conclude from that?
Right. So I sort of like don't like philosophy in that. Well, see, it's like hard to like. Well, what do you mean by philosophy? But I have a problem with. So I'm sort of like an anti-metaphysics. Like I'm not. I don't like metaphysics. Right? I'm sort of agrees with Quine a lot, and the reason is because a lot of the theories in metaphysics don't make a difference to experience. Like it doesn't make any predictions, and so a lot of times all you're left with is sort of intuitions about thought experiments. But the point that I'm making about this argument is something more interesting than male intuitions. What I'm saying is, I'm giving thought experiments that I think most people would agree with this intuition. So I'm also making an empirical claim because I don't think anybody, I mean, this is like an empirical claim that I don't have any data for, but it just seems plain obvious to me that anybody, if you ask them, you believe this machine is extremely unreliable, right? Let's change the machine. Let's just say it's like you ask like some astrologer on the street or something, something plainly ridiculous like that. And they tell you that your cognitive faculties are unreliable. That in that case, that a defeater is not generated, and you're allowed, or you're allowed to conditionalize upon the belief that astrologers are unreliable, or the machine didn't work, or what a process you used. And this is going to be so, even though the effect that the astrologer reported took place before you formed any beliefs. Let's say that the moment you were born or something. Let's say that the planet Venus or the planet Jupiter or something was in a position, and if you're born at that time, your cognitive faculties are going to be unreliable. Something so silly like that. So I'm saying that in that case, I think most people would agree that a defeater isn't generated.
Sure.
And so even though the argument is going to be unsound, I think it's like, well, I don't think it's unsound. I think it's unjustified. I don't want to say it's any of the premises are false. I just don't see any reason to accept the defeater thesis. But what I'm saying is it's going to be unpersuasive to most people if you try and target their intuitions, because most people are not going to have the intuition that you can't conditionalize upon that astrology is unreliable there. So that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and so just so I understand, so what is that analogous to in the thought experiment that Plantinga gives?
So I think it comes back to the temporal aspect. So in this case, I had the belief that astrology or that the machine is horrible, is like unreliable, prior to forming the belief that the machine or the astrologer told me that my cognitive faculties
Yeah.
are unreliable. Whereas in the ones that Maverick or Plantinga use, the belief that's supposed to be that's supposed to deflect the defeater only comes after the defeater has been generated.
Yep. So what does Plantinga say about our belief in the machine or the doctor or the study or whatever it is that told us our cognitive faculties are unreliable in the first place?
Oh, it doesn't say anything. I think it's just built into the thought experiment that they're supposed to be reliable.
Yeah, that was the impression that I got. That they're supposed to be reliable.
It's sort of like, like Gettier cases, right?
Yeah.
You know those thought experiments, right? Like when you buy
how is it
or
like a
something.
Gettier case? Actually,
Oh,
might
no,
have guessed.
no,
I
no.
don't. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just, the example that I was going to give is just like when it tells you, like in the Gettier case or something, like your boss or something says that the guy who's going to get the job is going to have like pennies in his like pocket or something. It's not like you can say, well, how do you know the boss isn't a jokester or something like that? It's just sort of assumed in the thought experiment that they're reliable. So it's like the same thing here.
Yeah, I'm trying to see the close symmetry here, because see, in your example, an astrologer is telling me anything really, and I don't take them seriously because I don't believe in astrology, right? But in Plantinga's thought experiment, a scientist is telling me something, but I believe the scientist, right? But then I later find that there's reason to have maybe not believed the scientist, but then that doesn't affect me because it's already defeated by my cognitive faculties not being reliable. So, but if I didn't trust the scientist in the first place, is the point I'm making.
Now you're getting it. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. So let's say that like after the scientist tells you, let's say you believe that scientists are reliable. The scientist tells you about the mutation. You believe in the mutation, that and the mutation renders your cognitive faculties are unreliable. That gives you the defeater. But only after you got the defeater, you find some belief, you find some evidence. Let's say that you go to his library and you find all these astrology books or something, and you learn that scientist actually came. He himself came to believe in the mutation not because of some empirical testing, but just by like looking at the stars and doing astrology. In that case, even if you come to learn of that and form the belief, that still doesn't deflect the defeater because it was only formed after you formed the belief in the mutation.
Right. Actually, that's well, that one clicks very clearly to me, because that seems, well, again, intuitively, but that seems intuitively very clearly wrong. That you would still think that your cognitive faculties are unreliable, even after finding out that the scientist who told you that they were unreliable just like made it up or whatever.
Yeah, but the idea is supposed to be, how do you know that that belief that he made it up is true? Because you use your cognitive faculties to come to that belief.
Right.
And so that's supposed to be the idea.
Well, that's supposed to be the idea, but it just doesn't make sense.
So what I'm saying is, even obviously there have been like philosophy, again, there's like 10 or 50, there's like 10 people who write in that naturalism defeated ? And even some of them are even willing to say, look, even after I took the XX drug or something, and the doctor calls me like 2 days afterwards, that could still deflect the defeat, right? There are people who wanna say that. But what I'm saying is, even if you grant them that in those cases, like the case that I just gave now, that doesn't deflect the defeater, right? So like if you came to believe in it because of the scientist and you only found out afterwards that he formed the belief in the mutation because of astrology, not because of empirical testing, that in that case that you can't conditionalize upon that. I'm saying that even if you grant them that, all that's going to follow is that in the ex post cases, you have a N and E is going to give you a defeater, but it's not going to follow that in the ex ante cases that if you believe in N and E, that you have a defeater. And if that's the case, then the second premise is the defeater thesis is going to be either false or unsupported. I just don't remember how he phrased it. So I'm saying that even if you grant them all of this stuff, you grant them the first premise, that intuitions and intuition pumps are reasons for belief, you grant them all of this, and even these other things with like the astrology and the second premise is still going to be unsupported or false. So that's what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Well, I think so, but let me just see if I can understand what Plantinga would say in response. So I don't really know, but let me just imagine saying something. So couldn't he just say that the premise of the experiment is that you don't have that antecedent distrust, at least? Maybe you don't have antecedent trust necessarily, but at least you don't hold the view that the person telling you that your cognitive faculties are unreliable is analogous to an astrologer. Like, isn't that how the thought experiment is supposed to be set up? That you don't have an antecedent distrust of the source that's telling you about your
Yes,
cognitive
yeah,
faculties.
yeah, but we grant that. What I'm saying is, let's say that
But then doesn't
source.
your version isn't it not relevant then?
No. Here's why it's relevant, because I'm saying that in the thought experiment, let's say that antecedent source turns out to be unreliable, but you only but you didn't at the time know it was unreliable. If you come to believe what they say, then even if you find evidence that they were unreliable afterwards, that doesn't deflect the defeater. Did that make sense?
Hang on, I got lost there. Is that your view, or is that what Planck is saying?
No, so I assume what you're saying is you're raising an objection. You're saying that, look, in one case the source is trustworthy, and in the other case the source is untrustworthy, right? That was the thing that you were saying?
I was saying that under Plantinga's scenario, it seems that there is no antecedent disbelief or distrust of the source. Whereas in
Right.
yours, there is.
Yeah, but that's the very point that I'm making. That's the point. What I said is that's the ex ante, ex post point. What I'm
Yep.
saying is, even if we grant Plantinga that, all that's going to follow is the cases that are analogous to the previous, that there is no previous distrust, are going to give you the defeater. But I'm saying that not every single case of you believing in NNE is going to be analogous to that. Some are going to be more analogous to the case of the astrologer that I gave.
Oh, right. So then, okay, yeah. So I understand what you're targeting now. So you're saying that in the now I have to work Plantinga's analogy back. So what is the scientist analogous, like the scientist telling us this, analogous to in the actual case of N and E? Is this us coming to believe in N and E?
Oh, okay. I see what you're asking. So just quickly, can you read the second premise of the argument, the one that you had on screen from the Maverick's blog?
The person who believes N and E, naturalism and evolution,
Yeah.
and sees that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable given naturalism and evolution is
Right.
low, has a defeater for R.
Exactly. And I'm saying, and notice what that's saying. That's saying that simplicator, if you believe
Yeah.
N and E, you have the defeater. And what I'm saying is that the thought experiments that they're running would only entail that a subset of N and E, those that are sufficiently analogous to there is no previous distrust, are unreliable. But not every single scenario involving N and E is going to be analogous to that. And now you're asking, well, how do you connect the analogies? And what I'm saying is that before I believed in N and E, let's just say I'm not a naturalist or I believe in evolution. If I previously I see that R is low given those two beliefs, but I see that R is high given those two beliefs, and a third proposition that I believe in, and only after that I come and believe N and E. That's more analogous to the case of the astrologer than in the case of the scientist without an antecedent distrust.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It is a little bit maybe I'm just slow, but it is a little bit I don't know. There's a lot of steps here, it seems, but I get what you're saying about whether the analogy is closer to whether you have an antecedent distrust or not. And they're in premise 2 not making that distinction. I wonder if whether they inserted that distinction or modified the argument, it would make it more difficult for them to defend. Because it seems to me that it's going to come down to the question as to how people form beliefs in naturalism and evolution and sort of what beliefs are formed before or after that. But it seems plausible to me that before you form beliefs about naturalism and evolution, you're going to form beliefs about, I don't know, maybe your cognitive faculties or something, such that when I then form a belief about naturalism and evolution, I'm going to have an antecedent distrust of anything that says that my cognitive faculties aren't reliable.
So what I'm capitalizing on here is, in the astrologer case, you had the evidence prior, not posterior, right? And what I'm saying is, look, what if it's the case that you saw there's a third belief that in conjunction with N and the E, before believing in N and E, renders R high? And so that's given, in that case, I have the evidence prior to adopting the belief, not posterior to it. And that's going to be similar to me having the evidence that prior to the astrologer telling me my cognitive faculties are unreliable, that astrology is like bullshit, then that I discover it posteriori. Did that make sense?
Yeah. So to try to concretize this, what's an example of what that belief might be?
So for example, okay, so I'm going to give an example, but just to be clear, I don't think you need to even have an example for the objection to go through. But one example.
No, but I think it helps to understand the point.
Right. So like one example, and I think Fodor, Fodor as in
Jerry Fodor.
Jerry Fodor, yeah, makes this point because he also has a paper in the Naturalism Defeated question mark.
There you go.
Yeah, he has. So he specifically talks about our evolutionary history. So like specifically,
right, so
yeah, and he sort of says he doesn't phrase it this way, but this is like how I interpret him. He says sort of like if we go by abduction, the best explanation for our evolutionary history is going to be that our cognitive faculties are reliable. So it's going to be an inference to the best explanation. And so what I'm saying that P there could be our evolutionary history, such that naturalism, evolution, and our specific evolutionary history, the evolutionary history of human beings, would render R high and not low.
The specific evolutionary history. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I have to go actually pretty soon, but in way of sort of bringing these threads together, that's very interesting to me because I mean, I don't know if this applies to you as well, but although I'm very interested in philosophy, I see myself sort of first as a scientist. I guess I'm a scientist now, I'm doing PhD, but as a scientifically minded person, and then maybe second as a philosophically minded person. So that's relevant because when someone wants to separate from me the beliefs, like some sort of abstract proposition of naturalism and evolution, wants to separate those from our knowledge of our specific evolutionary history, that to me just seems odd, right? So you're sort of saying, well, look, let's put in P there, which is like our specific evolutionary history. And to me, it's not even very intuitive to separate that from like the belief in evolution, because how could you even get such a belief? I mean, I suppose in some abstract word you could get that, but to me, I kind of naturally just put that there because that's like how I understand evolution and also naturalism as well. So I think this comes back to what we've been talking about quite a lot, which is the conditioning question. I'm kind of just naturally conditioning on a bunch of stuff. So it's not strictly maybe just N and E. I think I'm just naturally putting P there, what you describe as our evolutionary history, and probably a bunch of other stuff as well. And so this is also a reason why I don't necessarily find arguments that try to abstract certain aspects of what we believe away from sort of other stuff that actually goes along with it, like tries to abstract an idea of evolution away from any particularities of our actual evolutionary history, which to me just kind of go together when I'm analyzing these things. So yeah, to put it together for those sort of reasons, and I think that you've kind of articulated the, I guess, formal aspect of how it works in terms of the arguments and the justifications for premise 2. Yeah, I basically agree, and I don't think that the argument I don't think the argument works. So,
but remember,
go ahead and make some final comments there.
Oh yeah. So just remember this thing, right? Like, how is it justified for them to exclude you from including the evolutionary history, but for them to not only conditionalize on mere theism, but to include Christianity as well, or that God created us in His image?
Yeah, and exactly. And I think that that's helpful that you sort of emphasize that. For me, I don't even like to play those sorts of games. I like to approach it more in the way that Oppie's described it, where you take the best theories in different categories and then see what they have to say about a bunch of different phenomena. And so under this view, I mean, anyone's basically entitled to whatever resources they want under their theory. It's just a question of then how well do those theories do in exemplifying the explanatory virtues. So in that sort of case, I don't have to tell someone what they can and cannot conditionalize on. And I don't know. I find that approach much more helpful, because the whole idea of deciding what you can and cannot in a given context conditionalize on, and what you have to pretend you don't know, and separate things out that kind of really only fit together, just is a bit bizarre to me. And I guess it's coming back in the way of saying I don't really like this style of argument. But anyway, yeah, So I thank you very much for your time. It's been really helpful for me actually to kind of get my head around some of these subtle distinctions. And
Mm.
hopefully this will
Yeah,
help
yeah,
with
no
my
problem. Good
conversation
luck.
next week with Maverick. Yeah.
Yeah, good
Cheers.
luck.
And-
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, just as a way of promoting, so tomorrow I'm going to go on Nathan's channel, Digital Gnosis, and we're going to talk about Bayesian approaches to the resurrection and look at the article from the gurus there. And then next week, as I said, I'll be debating Maverick Christian on evolutionary argument for naturalism. So there's a couple of things to look forward to. Yeah, so stick around for more of this sort of content. Thanks everyone for watching, and see you around.